Hello and welcome back to Railway Mania. Today's guest is no other than Tom AKA Jago Hazzard on YouTube. Tom has made it his mission to explore every inch of London, leaving no stone unturned or station unvisited. His videos are packed full of pub quiz facts about the history of the Big Smoke, particularly its transport empire. He also explained those little quirks that you've wanted to know, like what railway were those abandoned tracks part of, why are those two stations so close together, and a recent favourite of mine, why is the Central Line hotter than the sun? Tom, welcome to the channel.
Hello.
So I've given a little intro to your channel, but could you explain in your own words what's your channel about and how did it come to be?
Well, I tend to describe it as being about London, about railways, and about railways in London. It started out, actually, with a series called Useful Beer Reviews, the joke being that they weren't useful. But unfortunately, a lot of people didn't get the joke and just thought I was a really bad beer reviewer. Then I started doing a bit of stuff about model railways. I made a couple of videos about the Underground, which is something I've always been interested in. And they became really popular, like totally unexpected. So I mostly do Underground stuff, but there's other railway stuff in there, there's other London history stuff. I try to keep it fairly varied.
And so you say you've always been interested in the Underground, but how did you get into railways to begin with? Where did that all start for you?
Well, to be honest, I've been into railways pretty much as long as I can remember. I mean, it's a family thing, really. My great-granddad was on the North Staffordshire Railway. My great-uncle was at Crewe Works. I had another uncle who was a plate layer. And yeah, my dad was and indeed still is into railways. And I guess it kind of came from there. I think it was sort of inevitable, really.
You really had no chance of escaping, did you?
Well, my sister seems to have escaped, but she's just tormented by me, my brother and my dad ranting on about, about the merits of Drummond or whatever.
That resonates with me. I remember every birthday it was a trip to a steam centre. I mean, my poor family. I had to put them through. It was just, train chat all the time. Your channel, from small beginnings, it's grown to a fascinating Did You Know archive of all things historical London. And you say it started with the Tube, but how did the topics evolve over time? So you say it was a bit of a surprise for you that it was such a big hit. How did you make the decision to carry on with it and to sort of capitalise on that and say, well, actually, this is really interesting and people were really interested in it? And then how did you develop that?
I used to have a blog ages ago. I don't think it still exists, thank God. But that had a bit of stuff about the history of London. It wasn't so railway-based. And I had been thinking about the idea of going in the direction it has gone, more or less from the start. It's just that when I started, I knew nothing about filmmaking. I mean, I still don't. I'm just better at hiding that fact. Well, I didn't really have a plan with the channel. The real surprise for me was that people were interested in the railway stuff, because it's something I've always thought of as very niche.
I guess that for people in London especially, they're growing up around all this stuff. They're so used to it, it's part of the furniture. So to actually delve into that and think about, well, where did this come from?
Yeah, I think that's partly it. I think people like this idea that there's this, these secrets all around them, as it were, like this, this canopy support indicates, that this railway built the station, or there's a sign there that indicates...
Well, as an example, it could be something like we said in the intro, why are these two tube stations so close together? People might say, well, there's some with huge gaps between them, but if you were thinking about this, you wouldn't put two stations across the road from each other on different routes. It's answering those questions that people have always wondered, but never really had the sort of inclination to look it up for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, quite often that's how a video starts. It will just be kind of thinking like, why is that a thing? So I've got a video coming up, it's called The Many Names of Bank. And it's about the starting point was, why are Bank and Monument, like, why do they have two separate names when they are the same station? And then I discovered that the Waterloo and City line called their platform their City. So it's like, oh, okay, so there's three names for that station. Then I discovered at various points with various lines, it's also been called East Cheap, Cornhill? Like, it just sort of grew from this small question into this.
So it's even more complicated than we thought.
Yeah. And once you explore the names, then it gets into like why it would have so many names, what the nature of the companies going through there. Yeah, it's often sort of a case of pulling a thread, I think.
You say that your blog was originally more about general London history. So would an example of that be your video about, say, the history of Gin Lane and why is it called Gin Lane and what was the gin craze and things like that? So how did you go about introducing those into what was a railway-focused kind of YouTube channel? Was that a conscious decision to expand that into the greater London, I could say?
To some extent, it's always been me talking about the stuff that interests me.
I think that certainly comes through. I mean, you're clearly knowledgeable and passionate about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was a case of, well, I tried this and people seemed to like it. The first non-tube video was probably the one about the witch who supposedly lived on the site of Camden Town Station, which wasn't a very tube-related video at all, but I called it that. I think I originally wanted it all to be nominally about the tube, but I think after a while it's like, well, this is a ridiculous pretense. Let's stop fooling ourselves and start.
Well, I think you're in the perfect place because, as you know, the tube runs through everything in London, so anything I guess could be tenuously related to the tube in some way.
Yeah, I mean, if not the tube, then the transport network in general. I mean, I did one on the Woolwich Ferry recently, and I was kind of thinking, well, it's okay, it's not on the underground, but people who travel in London would probably be at least passing familiar with. So
you were showing the information about the ferry, and I was like thinking, why has the ferry got that name? And then you immediately went on to explain it in the video. So you're clearly thinking about how people are processing information that's put in front of them and what they're curious about. And does any of that come from your viewers? Do you get any cues from them when they're asking about stuff in the comments and things like that?
I often take sort of ideas from the comment section and, suggestions. Sometimes you do have to realise that you can't please everyone, but there's a lot of times when people have said, oh, I'd be interested to know this, or like...
What's been a recurring topic that people have continually asked you about?
There's a few ideas. The one I did recently on why the Underground has 4 rails was one that kept cropping up.
That is, I think that perfectly sums it up. It's like, who has stood on an underground platform and just looked at the track and gone, why is there 4 rails? And then got on the train and immediately forgotten it, that they wondered it. And then they'll wonder about it every time they'll see it again. But they'll never go to look it up themselves.
Well, it was a weird one for me because I realised that I didn't know exactly. Like, I knew that one of them put the electricity into the tube train and the other one took it out again, maybe. I'm not good with electrics, and it's a miracle I haven't set fire to anything yet. That was kind of that is an interesting question.
Yeah. Here's another question. How on earth do you make so many videos so efficiently? I mean, what's your release schedule at the moment? I mean, how many are you making on average over a given time period?
So it's 3 videos a week. There's some extra stuff over on Patreon.
Nice plug.
So a lot of it involves being fairly flexible about the way I make videos. I will aim to do the film. I tend to film at weekends. I'll aim to get enough footage for a few videos. So, for instance, the Woolwich Ferry and the North Woolwich branch videos were filmed on the same day. The London and Blackwall, the Smithfield Market and the Millennium Inclinator were all filmed on the same day. I also have an awful lot of B-roll footage. Like, there's a lot of shots that get used in more than one video. There is one guy in the comments section who noted of some footage of Farringdon. Like, oh, I see she hasn't had the baby yet. Like, yes, all right. I'm not going to go to Farringdon every time I need a shot of Farringdon. But
hey, it shows commitment. He's been watching for that amount of time anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I take it as a compliment. And yeah, I sort of try to actually make 4 videos a week so that, I can sort of slow down. I'm not working breakneck all the time. And also, if there's any technical issues, then I have time to slow down and sort it out. And
what are you using to create it from an equipment point of view?
It's actually really basic. I film on an iPhone 7. I edit on an iMac. I just use iMovie. I have this microphone whose name I have forgotten. I mean, I was until fairly recently doing it all on my phone, but that I just found it became too limited, and it started getting glitchy on me.
I think it's incredible though, because that shows that there shouldn't really be a barrier of technology to people who want to do this kind of thing.
Well, this is the thing. This is, people get sort of blinded by this notion. Like, they see these incredibly complex videos and they just think, well, I could never do something like that. And it's like, well, don't try to do something like that. Like, just figure out what you can do with what you've got and build up from there. I think it's like that for anything creative.
And if you can tell a story in an engaging way, it doesn't matter about any of that stuff.
Yeah.
It just matters about how you're telling the story, and are you entertaining and educating your audience in the way that you want to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's some really basic YouTubers who have an enormous audience. I mean, one of the first YouTubers I really got into was Ashens. And he just has a camera pointing at his sofa and he just talks about things. I mean, I think in a sense that was what kind of inspired me to give it a go. It was that, it doesn't have to be, lots of flashy animations and clever graphics and, expensive stock footage or whatever.
Yeah. You don't just have to throw money at it. So some topics which may not fit into everyday conversation so well and might seem too niche, too geeky, I think they actually turn into entertaining stories. How have you found the task of being able to turn something which at first it seems like just a series of events into a concise video and tell a story about it? What's your process for that? Because presumably you've just got information to begin with. How do you think about, I'm going to make this a good length, I'm going to tell a story start to finish in this length of time?
A good way to start thinking about it is, when you try to explain something to a small child and they just keep saying why, why. In a sense, it's a bit like that. It's like, okay, why is this here? Why did they put it there? Why is this person who would put this in this place? A lot of the time, that's how it comes about, and it's as you sort of find out more, then you find out the sort of odd little bits of human interest. So regular figure in my videos is Charles Tyson Yerkes, the American entrepreneur who...
Yeah, the sort of tycoon of the underground.
Yeah, very dodgy character. But that guy means that I can sort of add a bit of human interest into...
For anybody who's not heard of Yerkes, can you just give a little outline of who he was?
Yeah, so basically he was this businessman in Chicago who was, well, he's most famous for his work on the tramway network, but he was also a very shady character. There was a lot of financial jiggery-pokery, a lot of bribery and blackmail, and eventually he basically got run out of town. He came over to London. At the start of the 20th century, there were a lot of schemes going forward to build underground lines. He wasn't the only American investor who was interested in it. At the time, Britain kind of had this reputation in America as poor old John Bull, just ripe for American investment. So Yerkes bought up lots of these planned tube lines and did much the same over here as he did over there. Financed them in an extremely dodgy way.
So a bit of, around the bit of a golden palm kind of thing.
Yeah, a little bit woo, a little bit wee, a little bit...
Yeah.
Then he died in 1905 before any of the lines were actually opened, and the whole thing nearly fell apart, but Albert Stanley, later Lord Ashfield, took over and was a superb manager, basically pushed it on to opening, and then the rest is history.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of railway history in general, and history in general, is personality driven. Like, I think if Yerkes hadn't been this incredibly shady guy, then maybe we wouldn't have got the underground, at least in the form it is. So yeah, to go back to kind of the original point, I think quite often it's a case of finding the human element, because once you've got the human element, then you can really get the story in. And the human element might be the entrepreneur who builds it, or it might be the people that the line serves, or someone who opposes it. That's kind of it. And once you've got that in, then you can sort of call back to it in later videos and things. So, like, Yerkes is now kind of a running joke in my videos.
Yeah. He's like the recurring character. He keeps cropping up.
Yeah, one of these days I'll make a T-shirt with him on or something. That'll be in the.
You've got to get on the merch.
Yeah.
They're all really concise stories. So you have a consistent video length, which I would describe as a good tea break length. You know, your kettle's boiling, you stick a video on, you learn something straight away. Was that a conscious decision? How did you arrive at that? And how have you found that to make as a constraint to make things in?
My general philosophy is that I make the video as long as I think it needs to be. Like, the one thing I hate in a YouTube video is when it's like half an hour long, but it's got like 10 minutes worth of content. And I find that just 5 to 7 minutes is, if you're talking about a station or something, you can usually get everything across in that time. It was also partly a practical thing, because as I say, I was using my phone, and it got to the point where it just couldn't handle anything longer than 7 minutes. And then it got to the point where it couldn't handle anything longer than 5 minutes, and then it was time to upgrade. Yeah, I would say that 5 to 7 minutes will cover most topics. Sometimes there's more information, like the North Woolwich video, I think, was about 12 minutes.
So that's tea and a biscuit, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, my one thing is that I don't want to make it longer than it needs to be. I don't want there to be any dead space, as it were.
Here's the question you want answered, and here's where it starts, and here's the facts.
That's something that I kind of aim to do.
And I think a lot of them are sort of phrased around questions. Like the example I gave in the beginning is, why is the Central Line so hot? Something I've always wondered as I've been sort of losing half my body weight in sweat when I'm travelling on it. Why is it so damn hot in here? And you start with that question that sort of intrigues people. And I know it's like a classic clickbait thing, but I think that this is something that people genuinely wonder. And it has occurred to them. And I know I keep coming back to this, but this is a common shared experience that people are interested in. And I think that little hook that you've got there, it works really well.
Yeah, I don't like clickbait. I don't think anybody does. In a sense, I think it stems from my own experience watching YouTube videos, where it is like, right, get to the point.
Yeah. Show me the money. So I'd initially thought about, when I did this podcast, that I would be running out of topics at some point, and then I found myself up late at night sketching out an episode about the merits of different types of model railway couplings. So did you at any point think that you would run out of topics, or is it sort of the iceberg effect where, you know, it looks small on top and then as you dig deeper you uncover more and more?
I think it is kind of the iceberg thing, because there is a part of me that thinks, 3 videos a week, but it's quite often the case that I'll be researching something and then something else will crop up, sort of drag me off on another tangent. One that I haven't recorded yet is what is the point of the Waterloo and City line? Because it's something that people keep asking me, and it's like, well, it is pretty useful. And yeah, that came about because I did the video on the reopening of the Waterloo and City line, and yeah, it's like there is always something new. So on Friday I released a video about King's Cross Goods Yard, and some people in the comments talked about this air race that started near there, and that's an interesting thing to talk about, so that's probably going to be a video at some point.
But I guess that's another thing, is that even as you're doing this historical record of things, London is constantly changing and evolving anyway.
Yeah, that's a big thing, yeah. Like, well, for instance, some people have asked me if I would talk about the upcoming Bakerloo line extension. That's been put on hiatus because of COVID, so that's another potential topic. I mean, yeah, there's always something new. Like, they're working on the Northern Line extension. There's ideas for extending the DLR. There's stations that have opened or closed. I keep getting people asking me about Crossrail, if I'll ever cover Crossrail, which I'd like to, but it's not opened yet, and I think there's going to be a lot more to talk about before it does open.
I think that it would be really interesting. There's a lot of your videos where you're looking at stations where, you know, there's abandoned areas and there's always like maybe abandoned stations, and there's always some plan, some scheme that it's like somebody wants to reopen it or something like that. I think it would be really interesting to see what happens to those further down the line, because over the course that you're doing these videos, there's a lot of projects underway and there's a lot of schemes that have been proposed. So it would be really interesting to come back at some of those ones from earlier videos and see how that's changed.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the Waterloo and City line is kind of a case in point that, you know, that was closed off completely for the pandemic. You know, we had all these other stations that got closed off for the first lockdown. You know, TfL is quite short of money at the moment, so that's obviously going to affect things going forward. With general railway history, there's a lot of stuff that changes in hindsight. Like, well, British Rail wanted to close Marylebone Station, for instance, because they just thought it would be of no use, and then the Western region...
And you go there today and you think that's mad. Like,
yeah.
What?
And I mean, St Pancras, they were going to close that one, and, you know, obviously now...
Yeah, international terminal.
Yeah, there was an idea to knock down Victoria and turn it into a heliport, because in the 60s it was like, no, helicopters, man, that's everyone's going to have a helicopter, man, just trust me, 1987 we'll all have helicopters.
What's been sort of your favourite subject area to cover? I mean, tell me about what's been really good to cover on the Tales from the Tube.
That's an interesting one. I mean, my favourites have been the lines in the Docklands. Like I've talked about the London and Blackwall Railway, the North Woolwich Railway, the Silvertown Tramway. I like those because there's so much that you can still see. Like there's a lot of detective work there, and there's a lot of stuff that's been recycled. You know, you kind of have that modern day interest. Like, you know, if you look out of the DLR here, then you can see the remains of this station.
Well, I guess with those, they're so much a part of London's past as an industrial centre as well, which just doesn't really exist anymore.
That is a big thing as well, yeah. Because, yeah, the docks were just enormous. I mean, it's incredible. I'm absolutely obsessed with the docks. My big model railway project, my big sort of someday layout is going to be based on the Port of London Authority railways. And indeed, I keep meaning to do a video on it, but again, just the topic keeps expanding.
What I was staggered by in your video about the North Woolwich line was that they kept cutting it in half to build more docks. And I thought, in my head, it was all built sort of around the same time, and it was, you know, just there, and the railway went around it. But actually, it was this constantly evolving place.
Yeah, with the railways, the sort of constant evolution meant that. So you had these lines that were built around the very old docks around West India, where, you know, they had to have like tiny little locomotives, like, you know, 040s, and then for the Royal Docks, which were the ones that kept annoying the builders of the North Woolwich Railway so much, they were much more modern, they had much bigger engines, so you got a lot of variety there.
And I guess the ship sizes kept going up, you know, the demand on space was so great.
Yeah, and eventually that was what killed the docks, because by the time containerization came in, they just couldn't expand the docks anymore, so they just moved.
Exactly the same here in Bristol. I mean, I'm sitting now on the banks of the River Avon, which skirts its way up the gorge, and you just think you'd never get something of modern size down there, and it's no wonder the docks shut as a commercial enterprise.
I think it's a real shame that so much of the old docks is now gone. Like, I can remember not so long ago, sort of walking around all these derelict warehouses. I mean, there was a lot more of the old railway network in the docks, and so much of it has just been knocked down to make way for skyscrapers. I mean, there are quite a few surviving warehouses, but I'm one of those weirdos who likes the dereliction. You know. Yeah,
I mean, it's sort of that impossible thing, isn't it? You like it at a point in time that's impossible to preserve. When we were recording one of these podcasts in London, we were in a hotel on the edge of one of the old docks, and I think it was really great to see that the old cranes had been preserved and actually incorporated into the docks environment, because, you know, we've only got 4 left here in Bristol because they just knocked them all down.
Yeah.
They were all gone. And it was so great to see so many of them, sorry, even if they're in static form and, you know, they're non-functioning and stuff. But it was great to see a little teaser of what it might have been like.
Yeah, like I believe one of them is actually being turned into an Airbnb. I dread to think what the plumbing arrangements must be like, but
Gravity.
yeah, well, yes, let's hope it's not a particularly busy part of the docks. Yeah, I do think in general these days there's a lot more respect for industrial heritage than there was, 30 or 40 years ago.
What do you think is a good example of that in your travels in London? Where have you seen where the industrial heritage of London has been incorporated into the modern?
I mean, one that I find quite interesting is King's Cross Station, which I honestly think now looks better than it has in about 100 years, because they've cleared out all the rubbish from in front of it. They've moved everything kind of round the side.
So this is where they had like a sort of modern extension on the front of it.
Yeah, it looked like a bus station. And there's been something like that there since at least LNER days. There's more appreciation for the value of the old architecture. Like, I don't think these days something like the demolition of the Euston Arch would happen.
Yeah, well, I mean that. But Euston Station, when you talk about the rejuvenation of St Pancras, King's Cross, they look better than they've done in nearly 100 years. And you look at Euston and you think something's got to happen with this. It is gopping. It's just that time when there was no appreciation for the history of the area, and it was very modern looking and it was very brutalist, and now we're left with that and we're thinking it doesn't quite fit in. We've kind of in the same position they were in with their creation, so you kind of think something's going to happen with this.
I think at the very least they should try to make it distinctive, because it's an odd thing. Like, I get this very clear mental picture if you tell me, St Pancras, King's Cross, Paddington. If you asked me to draw a picture of Euston, I would have real trouble.
It's a rectangle.
Yeah, it's like there's this bit.
It's a rectangle, and you just colour the inside with shadow.
Yeah, they are doing some rebuilding for High Speed 2. I mean, I think the big problem is there's just no front to it, as it were. Like, there's no. I always think with the 19th century railways, they were kind of trying to impress people.
Well, you see that with King's Cross and St Pancras. Like,
yeah.
How much of just a game of one-upmanship is it? Like, because it's just our station's bigger than yours.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of very much meant to impress the travelling public. I've heard it said that one of the things with Paddington was that it was. I mean, I don't know how true this is, but it was kind of deliberately designed so you'd get this big reveal as you come around the curve. And I just don't think Euston has that. I think it's very kind of, look, you're getting on a train, there's the station, there's a sign that says Euston. What more do you need?
Yeah, okay, just get out of here.
Yeah,
just passing through. You're just a commodity.
Like, do you know how much this line is losing?
Quite. I want to talk about time travel for a bit. So, you've looked a lot into the history of London. If you had, here's the time machine, when and where in London would you go back to be an observer for a day? Where do you want to go to?
I think I'd like to go back. I'd actually think I would like to go back to the Regency era, because it just seems like a particularly crazy era to me.
So we're going far back then.
Beginning of the 19th century.
And where in London would you land your time machine in this strange fictional world that we've created?
I would probably say Mayfair, because...
Well, you could buy it and win Monopoly.
That's a thought. And back then you could probably get it for threepence halfpenny or something.
Exactly.
Back then it's like you had the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, you had the Napoleonic Wars, you had just a lot of crazy people. Like you'd have people like all these mad gentlemen who'd be betting on raindrops and Is there any character you would try and seek out from that period? Maybe the Prince Regent.
Why is that?
Like, I don't think he'd be particularly likable as a person, but he seemed to hang out with a lot of interesting people.
But I'm interested about this. So why the Prince Regent and his gang? Like, what kind of stuff were they doing? Can you give us a little snippet of information about that? Why is that so interesting?
These were people who just had no sense of personal responsibility. These were people who would get absolutely trashed every night. They'd gamble, they'd Yeah, they sleep around. They just get into all sorts of insane, just nonsense. Just all these things that nobody would dare to do these days.
So to go back and just get absolutely hammered and party for a day with some sort of Regency era dandies.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, it's a perfectly good use of the time machine. It's as good as any other use of the time machine that I've heard, certainly.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of eras that I think would be pretty good for partying. I mean, Charles II's gang, that would be another lot that I'd probably want to hang out with. Honestly, there's stories about them that are quite entertaining, but probably not suitable for a family audience.
Well, let's add some constraints to this. So I'm going to give you the paradox-proof time machine, and I'm going to say, Tom, you have to go back to 19th century London, and you've got to find them, and you've got to say, don't do that when you're planning the tube network. Do this instead. What change do you make to fix the tube network in London?
Probably the big one would be that I would get Edward Watkin and James Stats Forbes and knock their heads together and just be like, no, stop arguing.
And so can you give us some context to that? So Edward Watkin of the Great Central and the Metropolitan Railways?
Yeah, the Great Central, the Metropolitan, the South Eastern Railway. Charles Stat Forbes was the London, Chatham and Dover and the District Railway, among others. And
they didn't get along.
Yeah, basically these two just hated each other's guts. Like, they could not get along, and there is so much of the mess on the British railway network as a whole comes down to these two. Like, the South Eastern Railway and the London, Chatham and Dover Railway basically bankrupted themselves trying to outdo each other. What happened with the Underground was that the idea was that the Metropolitan Railway was going to build a circle line. They formed a separate company to build the southern half of it. It was originally going to sort of merge back into the Metropolitan Railway. It was that sort of 19th century railway thing where you create a company to get it built and then you take it back. And
was the idea of this a bit like Le Petit Saint-Cyr in Paris, where you have the sort of belt that goes around of normal standard gauge railways, not a tube line as such, but it just circles the city, and it enables all the other railways to come into it like a hub?
Yeah, I mean, it was a similar concept to that, yeah. I mean, to some extent, the Metropolitan Railway was that, although, again, they kept arguing with people, like the Great Western would have nothing to do with them, and yeah, it was all very silly. But the problem with the Metropolitan District Railway, the one building the southern half, was that it cost a lot of money. They were building through this very swanky, already quite developed area where there were already quite a lot of railway lines. So they just didn't have any money. So the Metropolitan sort of lost interest in taking over. The whole project I think it wound up taking about 20 years to get complete. Watkin became, I think it was in 1871, Watkin became the manager of the Metropolitan. And I believe it was the following year that Stats Forbes was put on the district, because he kind of had a reputation as being a troubleshooter. But these two already hated each other from the Southeastern Railway business, and eventually they had to form a separate company to get the circle completed, which eventually prompted the Metropolitan and the District to get their fingers out. It's just insane. It's
so it's an enormous amount of wasted effort and delays and everything else like that. So you're saying that what difference would that have made then to your future London that you're creating in this paradox-proof time machine that I've invented for the purposes of a question in a podcast? What does the London that you've created then look like that's different to the one now? I
would say that so for one thing, there's a circle line much earlier. I would say that the Underground becomes more... Oh, actually, now I come to think of it, we might not have the same Underground network at all. Ooh.
In what way?
Well, because it occurs to me that... So the District Railway got bought out by Charles Yerkes in 1901, I believe. It's sort of complicated. There was a lot of corporate messing around. I have this theory that, because the underground, you've got your subsurface lines, which is the Metropolitan, the District, Hammersmith and City, Circle, all of which are linked with the Metropolitan. Like, the Hammersmith and City was a branch of the Metropolitan, the Circle was half built by them.
And I guess a common theme with the subsurface lines is the trains are roughly sort of normal UK loading gauge size. I mean, probably a bit smaller, but then they're still tall.
Yeah. In some ways, it's kind of weird that these lines are also the underground. So I think that if the District was still part of the Metropolitan as planned, if they got together, then maybe we would have two underground networks. Because I think, sorry, this is all getting very complicated.
I love it.
But I feel like if the District was not owned by the same people who owned the Piccadilly, Bakerloo, Northern, Central, most of the lines apart from the ones owned by the Metropolitan, then maybe the underground network would just be the deep level lines, and we'd now have something like the overground network that incorporates everything that's on the surface.
So do you mean in terms of, like, normal trains from outside could actually just use these networks to get through London more easily?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Maybe you could bring in the Thameslink as well.
Why not?
Ooh.
For these people at the time, do you think they could have foreseen the growth of London and how it turned out?
No, I don't think so, because I think it's just so unprecedented. Like, you see it not just with the transport network, but just everything, like all these problems that arose in the Victorian era, like housing, sanitation, employment, well, even burial. Like, they just had this constant problem with burying people because they just weren't used to this many people being there. And it's the whole of Victorian London just was this kind of gradual discovery of, well, essentially the modern city.
And the absorption of the outlying towns.
In a sense, like the way the underground developed was really unexpected, because in the 19th century, just mass transit was not a concept that existed.
So I guess people generally lived where they worked or within walking distance.
Yeah.
And then there was this idea that you could travel to it. You didn't have to live on top of a factory or, on the farm. Then you could live outside of town and travel in.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's quite interesting. In Christian Wolmar's book, The Subterranean Railway, he talks about people sort of walking 6 miles into work every day, which is crazy. I mean, I live about 7 miles from where I work, and I wouldn't consider walking that distance.
Also, I can't navigate London without jumping on a tube, because all I know, I don't actually know how it all fits together. I just know what's immediately outside the tube stations. So for me, it's a strange concept to think about walking that distance and trying to navigate your way through a city like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something that I've sort of become better about, well, in many ways since starting the channel, because you do kind of have to think, this station is here, this station is here. How far are they? Like, again, it comes down to the thing I was saying earlier about trying to film everything in one go. It's like, right, well, what's around here? Oh, I thought that station was miles away.
And this London that you're creating, where you're banging Watkins and Forbes' head together, do you think that because of this, they could have created what we knew as London Transport or TfL now from the start, as in a cohesive network that sort of enveloped London rather than these competing and disparate lines?
Yeah, I think.
Or do you think that was inevitable? Do you think that starting out with private enterprise was the only way they could have got it done?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, because it's one of those. Something that I find quite interesting is that, I think different kinds of politics work in different eras. And I think in some...
Well, the Victorians famously competitive.
Yeah, like I think that competition, that laissez-faire capitalism kind of thing, was quite a good way to get things built. It depends, like it was a good way of ensuring that we had a railway network. And I think we wouldn't have got so much so quickly if it weren't for people looking to make a lot of money. I think we could say that for them.
Or outdo their rivals in a way.
Yeah, a lot of it does come down to the economics. Like the District Railway built out, a lot of their services were to try to make as much money by building as little as possible. So they ran a service to Richmond over the London and South Western Railways line because that was easy for them to do. Meanwhile, you had the Metropolitan, who saw themselves as a main line, who started expanding out into Middlesex and Buckinghamshire and all these places that really were nothing to do with London. Something that I think if you were creating a coherent network, you wouldn't do. You'd just... I mean, I think if you were there in the 1860s trying to create a coherent network, you'd say, right, well, we only really need to go out as far as, Vauxhall on this side and the docks there and nothing north of Islington. South of the river, let south of the river take care of itself.
Well, I guess, like you say, it just grew up with London. So as London grew, so did the railways. And I guess, in a way, the Metropolitan could have been quite forward-thinking in trying to create Metroland. And, maybe they had delusions of grandeur. I mean, you've just got to look at their locomotives. They're these huge, hulking, great big tank engines that were working these sort of express services for them. But you're right, that's how they saw themselves. So... And then to go from that to what we know today as big tube trains is quite interesting, because it just means that those areas are now absorbed into the greater mass that is London, and they helped create that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Metropolitan had this sort of odd situation, and I must admit I'm not sure exactly why, but normally the way it was that railways could take over, they could buy up more land than they needed, but they had to give it back afterwards, which the Metropolitan didn't have, so they were able to get into the property development business. There is some sort of complicated legal business behind it, which I must admit I don't fully understand. Maybe that would make a good video, though.
Well, that's the thing. They're almost developing the city themselves in that case.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was very...
They're putting the facilities there and then creating the demand for it.
Yeah. I mean, that's more or less why we have Wembley Stadium. It was like they went out to Wembley, wasn't much there. It's like, well, let's build this park here, so then people will want to come here, and we can sell them tickets. And then, of course, the park didn't go so well, and so they built a stadium there.
Yeah, just like you say, that's the classic Victorian capitalism. How much do you think that London was the sort of guinea pig for interurban transport?
Oh, I think very much so. I mean, I think you look at the way the Underground evolved, that it started with the Metropolitan, which was very much a conventional railway, apart from the fact that it went underground. I mean, they really objected to being absorbed into the Underground because they saw themselves as a main line. But then you started getting more experimental things like the City and South London Railway, which was a deep level tube, smaller loading gauge, electrically powered. Then, you had the Yates Tubes, where it was created sort of as a network. The Yates Tubes being the Bakerloo, the Piccadilly, the Charing Cross branch of the Northern Line, where, you had this identity as the Underground, the same architecture, the same loading gauge, power supply, everything like that. And yeah, I think between 1863 and 1933, London went from baby steps in urban transport to effectively the modern transport network. And I think in other cities they were kind of able to leap on the back of that. I was quite struck by how much the Budapest metro reminds me of the London one. Like it feels like they started out with the Yates Tubes. Now the basic template of a tube line, everybody knows what it is.
And do you think that was established by Yerkes' ideals?
Yerkes, but I think also in some ways more his management team, as it were. Like you had Albert Stanley, you had Frank Pick, there was the company architect Leslie Green. They came up with these ideas that made it more of a network. They also made deals with other tube lines to sell tickets that were valid all over the Underground network, even the lines that weren't part of the Yerkes group, as it were.
So pretty much a precursor to day ticket today.
Yeah,
on
definitely.
TfL, or like the Oyster card, basically.
And they worked on things like making sure that there was an interchange within the station. Oh, and they had concepts like the lines would not share track with anyone else, which is such a big thing. Like, it's kind of interesting that you go on the Circle line and you'll quite often have delays because there's a problem with one of the other lines, which isn't an issue with the deep level tubes, which have delays for other reasons.
Yeah, myriad reasons. What's the best tube line?
That's a controversial question.
What's your best tube line?
I mean, I'm quite fond of the Waterloo and City, but I think I'd say the District.
Why?
Because it's so varied. You've got the London and South Western Railway in the west, you've got the London Tilbury and Southend in the east, you've got LMS bits, you've got Great Western bits, you've got Southern Railway bits. So much of it is above ground. You've got all these different branches. It's the only underground line that ever went to the seaside. They used to have a service to Southend. And yeah, I just think it's a very varied and interesting line. There's a lot of architectural variation.
That's the enthusiast answer, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, you know what's coming next? What's the worst tube line?
Oh, the worst. I can't cheat and say something like the Northern City line. It's not even there anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good candidate, but give me one of the current ones.
Right. I'm going to say, and this is going to be a very controversial answer, the Circle line.
Okay, so it overlaps with the best one.
Yeah, and in a sense, that's kind of the problem. It's a line that's just. I think I'm partly annoyed because it always seems to be closed when I need to use it. But it's like it's responsible for delays on the other lines, either directly or indirectly. It doesn't go anywhere that other lines don't. Doesn't really have any interesting scenery except on the bit out to Hammersmith, which they stole from the Hammersmith and City line anyway. Yeah, I'm probably going to get lynched for saying it, but I think the Circle line.
You heard it here. The Circle line is the worst tube line in London.
I heard. So this was somebody else's opinion. There's a gun to my head.
Okay. What was the best one that was never built then? What would have been great that was one of the proposed lines that was never enacted?
Oh man, there are so many of them. Like I've got a list as long as my arm of lines that were never built. One, I don't know if you'd count it as a tube line, but it's often been suggested that Watkin intended for the Metropolitan Line to be part of this grand trunk route from Manchester to Paris. I don't think that would count as a tube line in itself, but the Metropolitan would have been part of it. The idea was that it was going to be like the Great Central to London, Metropolitan, South Eastern Railway. He had shares in a Channel Tunnel company, then the Chemin de Fer du Nord, I think it was, to Paris. If we're going to say purely in London, I've always been rather fond of the concept of the version of the Jubilee line that would have gone kind of through the Docklands and south of the river to Lewisham. I think that would have been quite useful.
It's very sensible.
For ridiculous ones, there was the pneumatic tube that was going to go across the river from Westminster to Waterloo. So
is that like an early version of the Hyperloop?
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, that's kind of a thing that I find interesting. Like, you know, Elon Musk makes a big thing about the Hyperloop, but it's really not a new idea. I sort of hear Brunel just being all like, South Devon.
Yes. So this concept is where you pack passengers into a sealed capsule and then you fire that capsule across, from one side of the river to the other.
Yeah, more or less.
I mean, I've described that, sounds like a fairground ride, but really this is in a tunnel, it's in a sealed tube, and you just pump air in behind it to push it along with air pressure.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that they experimented with at Crystal Palace. I have a feeling the remains might still be there. I keep meaning to head over there. They were never really able to make it work, for various reasons to do with the limitations of technology, really. I mean, they experimented with that. They thought about that concept for the City and South London Railway as well. I think only very briefly, though. They were going to go with cable haulage for that. But yeah, it's an idea that's sort of conceptually always been there.
Mm.
Yeah, just nobody's been able to make it work.
Yeah.
Whether Mr. Musk will, I don't know. A lot of people seem to be quite sceptical about it, but
I think that would be great to see, though. I mean, that's almost one of those steampunk ideas that but it was real. It is not from a fantasy novel or anything else like that. It was a real concept, and like you say, they trialed it, and there were experiments made. It would be so amusing to me to see that alternate reality where that was actually an option.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, it always fascinates me. I mean, one of the problems I have with the steampunk genre is that it's like, but there's all this stuff that really existed, or that was a real concept that you're just, that people just aren't paying attention to, like. Yeah, like pneumatic railways, or the concept of a line from Manchester to Paris, or just, and all these sort of odd bits of industrial machinery that were experimented with and never completed, or were just a one-off.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, I sometimes think it would be fun to do a kind of a steampunk story that uses a lot of stuff that was actually there. Trouble is, I think I'd sort of get so bogged down in the mythos.
The technical details, it would end up being a manual.
Yeah,
it would be a traveller's guide to London.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe
I could do like a role-playing game where it's like, Charles Yerkes is the villain or the hero.
That's a perfect segue into our last little bit of discussion. So I want to talk to you about tube games. Do you have any tube games? I'm going to give you an example of one of mine. This is how I survive on the tube, especially the Central Line. You win the game if you get on the train and you get the door seat at the very end, because then you can open the window and stick your shoulders in the window and you can actually get a nice breeze. You win that game. That's my favourite tube game to play on the Central Line. Do you have any tube games that you play in your head?
To be honest, I find these days I'm just constantly sort of thinking, could I do a video about that? Could I do a video about that? One is weird roundels, like looking for weird roundels. Like there's lots of stations that have sort of unusual roundels. The most famous one recently was David Hockney's Piccadilly Circus one. Like Moorgate has a Metropolitan Diamond. There's a stainless steel one at St Pancras. There's a concrete one at Borough. Yeah, one of these days I keep thinking I'd like to do a video just about weird roundels.
You could do a compendium of all the different ones that deviate from the brand guidelines.
Yeah. And like there's sort of odd ones where it's like it has the wrong typeface.
Yeah.
Or a weird spelling of the station name or something.
Well, this could be a sort of Pokemon Go for the Tube Traveller.
Yeah, oh, that'd be awesome.
Collect them all. Can I tell you about one of the other tube games you can play?
Yep.
This is for anybody who's listening to this. If you're going on the tube and you want to play this game in your head with yourself, is that you go onto the platform and you choose a random spot on the platform before the train gets in. As the train comes in, you stand perfectly still, and if the tube doors end up in front of you, you win.
Ah, yes.
And you get a runner-up if you're sort of off to the side of the doors, but if you're in the centre of the carriage and there's no doors around you, you lose.
Oh, that's actually something that I sort of long to achieve while filming. But the big...
is that the train would end up just in front of you.
Yeah, like that would just be a perfect shot. Like, ideally, you'd have a roundel directly opposite. Then as the train comes in, it sort of... It comes to a halt, and then the double doors are right in front of you, dead centre, and then they open, and ideally there aren't a bunch of people trying to get out. The final part is kind of the rub.
And you win the game. Can I ask you, what is next for your channel? Where are you going next, and what are you going to be telling us about?
Right, well, there's a few videos, because I like to get kind of ahead with my videos. The next ones I'm going to be recording are... I'm going to do one about Clapham Junction, which is a remake of an earlier video. One I'm kind of looking forward to doing about the Boundary Estate, which is the first council estate in Britain. But it's also notable because it's built on the site of Old Nickel, which was a slum, which was immortalised in the novel A Child of the Jago. So...
here we come. Yes.
Yeah.
Bring it all back together, yeah.
Yeah, I might even give it like a clickbait title, like The Death of the Jago.
Excellent. And then what does sort of 2022 look like for Jago Hazzard?
Well, I kind of want to get further afield, because while there's a lot in London, I'd like to cover more stuff that's a bit further out. Like last year I did a video on the Southend Pier Railway, which I really enjoyed making, not least because it was a trip to the seaside that I could count as a business expense. Also, It was just like a line that's very different. And there are a few lines that are kind of quite unusual or interesting. Like, I'd love to do the St. Ives branch. There's some lines in Ireland I'd like to do. People keep asking me to do the Isle of Wight.
Well, it's another place with an incredibly dense railway network back in the day.
Yeah, definitely. And, of course, famously, it has tube trains. They just got rid of one lot and brought another lot in.
This is the third time around for them, I think.
Yeah, it was standard stock, then 38 stock. There's currently a 38 stock carriage from the Isle of Wight on eBay at a frankly ridiculous price.
You tempted?
Yeah, it's that would be an interesting one. The Alderney Railway, that's a lesser known one, I think.
Well, was it a little diesel shunter pushing around some tube cars?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. There's some oddities, like it was invaded by Germany during the Second World War, so there's some German fortifications, and I'm informed that there's this flooded quarry that has a whole load of German artillery down there. Obviously, that would be a bit more difficult to film, but
so what we're looking at is sort of Jago's holidays.
Yeah, working holidays. If the taxman is listening, one idea I floated for a series that a lot of people have expressed an interest in is kind of a potted history of the pre-grouping companies. And to do that, I kind of want to get more along their individual lines. Like, I feel like if you're going to talk about the London and North Western Railway, you really have to get to Crewe. You know, if you're doing the London, Brighton and South Coast, you at least need to get to Brighton. So I'd like to do that. I don't know how far or when that's going to get done. I think it's going to require quite a bit of planning. But yeah, generally I kind of want to just sort of keep broadening the scope of the channel while still remaining on topic.
Lovely. Looking forward to it. If people haven't heard of your channel before and, they're just listening to this podcast, where can they find you?
Okay, I'm on YouTube under the name Jago Hazzard. I also have an Instagram where I post silly things mostly. There's a Facebook page which is called Tales from the Tube because I never got around to updating it, which again there's some silly stuff. There's also links to most of the videos, and I crop up here and there in other places. I sort of lose track.
Great. Well, all it remains for me to say is thank you so much for coming on and sharing a bit of your experiences of how you go about making Tales from the Tube and the stories behind London. It's fascinating, and it's, like you say, an iceberg that you just keep discovering more of. So I hope it continues for much more time to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.